Stefan. So, welcome to this meetup here today. We have a joint meetup between Azure Meetup Stuttgart and Azure Meetup Constance. I'd like to have it in that way because everyone should participate in that awesome talk today that Stefan is talking in a brief second. Really, I'm glad that so many are really interested in that topic. And so therefore, I don't want to just get your time wasted by just hearing me talking. But if you have any questions, please go on to Stefan, raise hand, or just ask, get into dialogue with him, and just have a little conversation. As I earlier said, if you have struggle listen to English and understanding parts, just also raise hand and ask. We will easily translate it into German, explain it a little bit, and then switch over to English again. So being inclusive as much as we can. Yeah, stay tuned. I'll pass the stage to Stefan now. He can introduce himself and his topic, and then just go on. Have fun.
Yeah, thank you very much, Thomas. Yeah, thanks for having me here. Yeah, it's a great to share the knowledge here. Now, as Thomas already mentioned, we have the third series or the third session of the series regarding Azure core infrastructure. So today we're gonna discuss, or I'm gonna make some recommendations and best practices how you're gonna set up a manageable enterprise core infrastructure on Azure. So also showing you some pitfalls, best practices, recommendations, and patterns. So what's best practice and what are the do's and don'ts to setting up infrastructure. So if you have any questions or something's coming into your mind, let me know, unmute your mic and ask directly. But we can also do a Q&A session at the end. And so yeah, I'm going to introduce myself at the end because I'm not so important. More important is the topic we're talking about and that you get most out of it regarding the knowledge and stuff. So what's the status quo in current environments or current companies? So most of all, it's the usual way into the cloud. Someone says, hey, let's define the core infrastructure for the enterprise. So regarding our cloud journey or the defined strategy. And then someone from the IT says, yeah, but we have already productive workloads on Azure. And then probably a face looks a little bit like that one here below, because nothing's really set up and someone created just some productive workloads running on Azure or any other hyperscalers. And so the governance probably is not set up. No one knows how the services are configured, and that's most or quite often the case when I work with customers. That someone starts implementing right away into the hyperscaler, but that shouldn't be the case. Yeah. So and then it comes more or less to this kind of successful enterprise cloud journey. So people are trying to push legacy software with violence into the cloud, and then it's more or less a big pain in the backside to work with this kind of software. I know a lot of customers have legacy software running on VMs, and then you move to VMs from on-premise to the cloud, and then the VMs are running in the cloud, but not any better. Also, this kind of application modernization and having the right landing zone or core infrastructure in place is quite a big challenge in organizations, because especially if you talk about banking or insurance, companies are quite big, processes are complex, and so it's not that easy, and we have to make sure that certain kind of prerequisites are fulfilled before we start. So what are the main challenges of customer if it comes to cloud workloads or with enterprise infrastructure environment? So make sure that the governance and compliance rules are set up before you're going to start. More or less, a lot of companies have, especially in banking, insurance, or also manufacturing, they need to be compliant. So auditor check that as well. Also, they check the cloud platform as well. It comes to high complexity if companies are distributed around the globe, so have several kind of subsidiaries or company sites around scattered around the globe. Especially networking can get very complex. Costs are increasing, or we have unexpected costs, and more often customers have also a lack of experience. So you need also certain kind of skills and need to know how to set it up the right way, that you can also do some kind of IT operations later on. Yeah, and you need the right partner probably. Yeah, I mean, probably there's only not one partner. There are also probably many partners, and you have to double check that as well, that you have the right partner for your recommendation, for your to set up your enterprise environment. What I also noticed is quite often the sentence, if you ask about the cloud strategy or cloud governance, we talked about that before, cloud governance, there's always, quite often there's the sentence, yeah, we're going to do that later. The thing is, if you don't do it in advance or you don't do it before, like you define your strategy or you define your governance, you could run into problems. Yeah, especially if you do not know in your enterprise cloud journey where to go. Probably you later on you will be somewhere where you don't want to be. And the technical debt is getting bigger and bigger. And sometimes, if, for example, if an department needs to get a virtual network with some subnets, sometimes normally it's a job by an hour or two, and then the job should be done with infrastructure as code. But quite often they take more than a week, and the other department doesn't like that. It's because then it comes to the question, why does it take so long to provide a VNet? Yeah, and also which is attached to the hub, for example. And this is then kind of, yeah, you have the costs of reworking, which is required, is getting bigger and bigger. And there are certain kind of disciplines we also talk about today, which you should consider in advance before you're going to start to add your resources on Azure, for example. So, but how are we going to do that? How we have to find or how we can find the right way to the enterprise cloud? So what we have to do now, first of all, we have to consider is, and that's quite often the case, that companies do not have a according cloud strategy. So first you have to define is where you want to go. I mean, it's like a little bit if you're going with your friend or girlfriend on holiday, define what's the destination of your journey. If you like beach and palm trees and sun and warm weather, probably Iceland is not the right destination for you. Yeah, but if you like other stuff like volcanoes and great landscapes and cooler weather, probably Iceland is the right spot for you. And the cloud journey is a little bit kind of the same. First of all, you have to define where you want to go and what you want to achieve. So what are your business goals? What are you expecting from the cloud before you're going to start? So cloud strategy is essential before you bring your workloads not only to Azure, also AWS, GCP. If you use HashiCorp, if you want to use a multi-cloud approach, whatever. So this cloud strategy defines more or less how you're going to get to the cloud. I mean, first, the first approach, cloud first, is an approach normally for most of organizations. It's not doable because they have already an on-premise infrastructure, and you don't get rid of it within the next few weeks or months. That's not possible. Then we have this kind of big switch transition that is more or less 5 years ago, where Azure and other hyperscalers came up quite fast, and then big organizations try to move big data centers to the cloud. But you can imagine how the island looks like here if the bus hits the island. And that was also a little bit kind of how the cloud project run during the migration phase. It was really a big pain sometimes. And then you have also group by group transition, which is also quite often the case for many customers. So they work more or less also hybrid, so iterative co-management. So normally you have some kind of hybrid a connection from your on-premise data center to the cloud, and you can decide which kind of workload you want to bring to the cloud and which ones you leave on premise. Yeah. So if we define a cloud strategy, quite often customers say, yeah, strategy, we have to go more in detail. If you cannot define a whole strategy, at least, please, we did it at customers as well, define a big picture. So at least that you know the big, broad picture where you want to go and what you want to achieve. Don't then talk about the details, but if departments want to start or workloads should be shifted and you are on time pressure, we can also talk about the big picture in general and then start with the first workloads. But be aware of that cloud strategy is a big part, and it's also not done within 5 days. It needs normally, it depends on the complexity of the organization, a little bit longer. A good indicator is the overall strategy. So you have a look at what the company wants to achieve, what kind of business goals you have, what are the stakeholders, who is involved in cloud projects normally, and define normally also time frames and milestones. So what you want to achieve to a certain kind of time by the end of the year, or also long-term perspective, midterm or short-term perspective, and so on. And define also the approach, what kind of strategy you're following. Yeah, if you're doing make or buy, what kind of governance you need. Doing your cloud native, cloud smart. So cloud smart, for example, is that means you can decide what kind of workload is it better on premise, is it better on Azure or AWS or whatever. Yeah. So you need some kind of migration strategy as well. And if you're doing app modernization, and what kind of skill set and staffing you need and how you're going to organize your company so that you're more or less also ready for the cloud. Because later on, quite often, organizations thinking in silos, and they are more or less focused or used to their certain kind of working process, but normally cloud functions a little bit differently, and you have to also work more in interdisciplinary project teams instead of silos. That normally doesn't work. So strategy is an important part, but it's not the only part for today. To get a successful enterprise core infrastructure, think about your strategy first, because otherwise I saw customers running in a complete different direction instead of where their destinations are. So that causes also a lot of pain, a lot of rework, and you have to have big restructure projects then to fix the issue. So in our mind, we can mark this cloud strategy then with a check. So let's see what else we have to think about. The second part, before we design any kind of infrastructure or enterprise cloud infrastructure, is the Azure governance. So I think the second series was about pure governance. So what are the topics? I give you a quick wrap up about the governance, but also my recommendation: don't add any Azure cloud resources without having a proper governance in place. So what does governance mean? So the normal situation is that customers quite often that we have plenty of global admins and subscription owners. So they can more or less going like here on the road from the left to the right and adding stuff, deleting resources, adding or provisioning big machines, which cost a shit ton of money. And what we need is some kind of a governance team which provides guidelines. So guidelines means that we have certain kind of rules on the tenant, which also regulates some kind of how we're going to work together on this Azure tenant, and who can do what, and also what kind of policies we have on this tenant. So which kind of features we need to we need to figure out. So the first thing we have to talk about is the billing and cost management. Billing is more or less where are coming from the subscription from. How are we gonna use invoices in a finance way, so then we can book also the invoices and so on. and how we manage costs. Do we need budget alerts? Do we have certain kind of alerts? Do we have also forecasts and stuff, how we can manage the costs? Then we have to set up the hierarchy, the Azure hierarchy with all the management groups and subscriptions. I think we had it very much in detail in the second series. We talk about naming convention. Naming conventions must be defined before we add Azure resources to the cloud, because names you cannot change on Azure. That means you either delete and recreate the resource. Another opportunity normally you don't have, or you use the name you gave, which more often is not really best, to be honest. We also need to define what kind of identity and access management we have. So who has permissions to what, and who can change or delete or provision what. This is some kind of role-based concept or role permission matrix we need. We also have to deploy policies on the tenant and provide some logs to protect our resources, for example, from accidental deletion. So what is locked, what's not locked? For example, do we have to lock test resources or dev resources, or only prodless resources? So we need some kind of strategy for that. And we also need a tagging strategy. Tags are super important. You can manage costs by tags. You can filter by tags. You can automate your processes managed by tags. So tags are changeable, but you also need that a certain kind of, I would say, also naming convention to tags. Otherwise, everyone is using tags, and you have a mess of tags, but you cannot filter anymore. Yeah. So that are the disciplines we talked about in the second series, no, first series, I think it was even, which we need to consider. And the governance team needs to take care of this kind of governance, governance capabilities on Azure. So why do we need that? I mean, if you think about like Azure is a game, we do not start to play the game right away. Instead, we first have to define the rules of the game. So there's the governance team, which is more or less like a referee, and showing how the games, or what are the rules of the game. So who can do what at which time, what are the processes, how's the turn going, left round, right round, even or odd. Yeah, it really depends. And then we have certain kind of, I would say, order on the tenant, and everyone is knowing when his or its turn to move on in the game, but not that everyone can do what he or she wants. That would be a nightmare even on the tenant. I saw a lot of Azure tenants messed up totally because everyone did what he or she wanted to, and that's really not helpful. And a big recommendation is also separate governance team from adoption teams. I know quite often the company is not that big, so probably there's only 1 or 2 person in the governance team, and the rest is all adoption, or even sometimes you're only 4 persons in IT, but then you have to change head. I mean, if you're part of the governance, or if you're part of the infrastructure. But in general, according to the Cloud Center of Excellence, it's highly recommended to separate the governance team from the adoption team. And what's also super important is, if we talk about the architecture, we talk about a cloud adoption framework. So Microsoft is offering this kind of cloud adoption framework with a lot of best practices, tools, documentations, recommendations. And I saw it quite often that people take that for granted. I mean, there are 2 words here in this chart. Yeah, this chart is, or this graphic, this illustration is from Microsoft. And 2 words are important: example and tailored. So you have to think about, if you defining your governance, how does my organization work, or what kind of process do I have, and what are I mean, that's only an example. It's not that this one size fits all, that you can take this kind of structure, implement it to your tenant, and then you're happy. That's not the case. Normally, you should do some kind of workshops to figure out what kind of hierarchy you need. what makes sense, what doesn't. Sometimes you can organize it by regions. Sometimes you can organize it by subsidiaries, by departments, depending on your requirements and your IT organization. But don't take that and implement it on each kind of organization, because normally it doesn't make the governance team happy, and you have later on issues allocating or defining role definitions, or assign rights, give permissions to users, or also to establish then the right or the Azure policies and doing the definitions and assignment. So Tailor is super important as design area before you start. So we think about our disciplines we have on the governance side, and we have this kind of enterprise requirements, and we have to bring that together. And I know it's sometimes it's really a hard job, and you have to consider such a lot of things like policies, role-based access controls, permissions, naming conventions, and so on. But before you're going to start, you should bring that a little bit in a kind of documentation or specification, that you have a proper plan, and you bring it to your tenant before you add any resources to Azure. So that, because then you can also make sure that you have a standard across departments, across subsidiaries, across probably different organizations, depending on your organizational structure. So governance is really, or having governance, Azure governance in place before we start with any workloads or any landing zones is super important. That was also where the most of the accidents happen. So governance, we can also do a check. So what's next? We talk about Azure core infrastructure. Microsoft says there, according to the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework, we need a landing zone. So today we're also going to talk about what is a landing zone, how we can provide it, and what is the Cloud Adoption Framework. So I provided a link here to the Cloud Adoption Framework in general. It's full of stuff. It's not only technical stuff, it's also how you organize your IT and your infrastructure, and also how you bring workloads and migrate workloads to the cloud. So it's really a great framework with a lot of stuff, which helps you to achieve your digitalization goals in the cloud. So also regarding strategy aspects, technology aspects, providing also tools, Excel spreadsheets, examples, checklists, whatever, which is also a good indicator if you want to start to move your workloads to the cloud. And it's a predefined structure approach for cloud transformation, so you get more quality into your enterprise organization, and also enterprise cloud infrastructure, and also more speed. So that this is the typical process. And guess what? Yeah, define strategy is first, as we already talked about. Then we plan how we do our stuff. We go to the ready phase, adopt, and then we have also this kind of governance as a ongoing process. So governance is also not a set it and forget it cast, but more or less it's an ongoing process, because cloud is an evergreen approach. It always changes. It always new services coming to the cloud. Old ones are deprecated. So the governance team must be aware of this certain kind of process. But why is the Microsoft framework alone not enough? Yeah, so we cannot Microsoft. It's like, we see what's a framework. A framework is for me like a construction kit, yeah, Baukasten in German. And with this, if you talk about a framework, we also have to add something. So, for example, if a customer says, "Hey, I want to have this kind of stuff here," and we would say, "Hey, I have a great framework. It looks like that." Yeah, a customer would say, "Yeah, but how many stuff do I need? How many wheels do I need? How many of these columns do I need? How many of the screws do I need? And how should I bring this all stuff together that it looks later on like exactly like that?" So this is the challenge. So what we need also is to bring also the stuff together. So the knowledge, how we set it up, and That means we need to have such kind of cloud adoption templates and standard-based blueprints for Azure in place. And this is what we have this built on top of. So on top of means the framework itself is not enough. We also have to bring something or our experience or the skill set together to set up the stuff what we need and what we want to achieve. Yeah, that's not always that easy. So I brought an example for Azure Cloud Core Infrastructure. I'm gonna move that a little bit, and hopefully you can see my screen. So I know it's quite small. I will go in more or less a little bit more in detail for this stuff as well. So as you can see, we have on the right side, we have here the on-premise side, and on the right side, we have the Azure, the Azure side. So what we're going to start is we have to think about requirements. So how do we set up the landing zone? What kind of stuff we want to achieve? Also that we have to make sure that our landing zone we want to design is according to our governance policies. Yeah. So we cannot implement any services that are against our policies or that would violate our regulations. That's not possible. And we have to define or design this overall network topology, how it looks like a little bit here. Yeah. So we normally start from on the on-premise side and go then from the on-premise side more to the Azure side. We also have to consider what kind of SLAs, so service level agreements, do we need? That means also, do we need some services which are zone redundant, for example? Do we have to talk about disaster recovery as well when we define or design such kind of landing zones? We also have to talk about responsibilities. Who's responsible, for example, for the VPN connection here, or for the Azure firewall, or for the Bastion host? Do we have any shared responsibilities? How do we spread our Azure resources across regions, availability zones, or region pairs, for example, to get or to have more more uptime, yeah, and have to achieve a higher SLA? And how are we going to implement the whole thing here with infrastructure as code? This challenge will come later on as well. So if we start from the network architectures design, I mean, we see in the middle, we see this kind of big network. That's what we call a hub. So what we have here is a clear hub and spoke architecture. So the hub in the middle, everything in the hub is a shared service. So the shared service is not only used by one department or one organization. It's normally used by many organizations. So this one are here inside the hub are all shared or central services. What we have to define is we have to talk about network segmentation. So we have to build up some kind of security zones. As you see, the first zone is, or the first logical separation is the VCs running crazy. No. Is this kind of hub. So we have the IP address of the hub. We have a 21/21 subnet, and we have plenty of VNet, and we have plenty of subnets. And we also have to think about how we're gonna route the traffic through the network. That means, I mean, for example, can this machine directly contact this machine, or does the machine needs to go over the Azure firewall for security purposes and to contact this machine? So we also talk about the routing. Normally, you have route tables in place. So place route tables on Azure subnets, which controls your traffic and says, hey, the next hop of your traffic is the firewall. So more or less,
Stefan?
the Azure firewall, or also NVA, is your central point of truth regarding your rule sets, and also regarding ports, protocols, IPs you want to open, which is also super important.
Stefan, just a short interruption.
Yes.
Can you zoom in a little bit more?
Yes, of course. So better?
I think so, yes. And there was a request in chat. There are also some questions, but I want to put them a little bit afterward.
Okay. I cannot see the chat.
No, that's okay. So
Okay.
there are a lot of questions. So maybe
Okay, a lot of gaps. That's good. Yeah, and we have to talk about network segmentation and the routing concept. What we talk about as well is DNS. So DNS and name resolution is a big topic because we have to think about how we're going to route our DNS traffic, because both must be possible. We have to route the traffic from on-premise to Azure, and also we have to resolve names from Azure to on-premise. Probably that's the normal situation, I would say. There are certain kind of possibilities. We can use the DNS proxy on the Azure firewall. We can use the Azure private DNS resolver to configure the DNS resolution here. There are so many opportunities, but I don't want to go more into details because otherwise we got lost. I only tell you what you have to consider before you start, for example. Now my VCO fucked up. So DNS is a big topic. Also, what we have to consider as well is the hybrid connection. So if we start from the on-premise side and we think of, yeah, we need an Azure a central hub, or like for a landing zone. We need a connection between our on-premise data center and the hub itself. Quite often we use customers say, yeah, we need an express route. You can use an express route. Yeah, that's fine. It's a private connection from your on-premise data center to Azure, but it costs a lot of money. And the second question is, do you really need it, or why do you need it? We always talk about requirements. If it's really needed, I mean, fair enough, but more or less, quite often customers say, yeah, we don't know, but express route sounds good. We have to talk about that. Probably sometimes also a VPN connection with an active or passive connection matches the requirements as well and saves you a lot of money. So that's why we talk about the connection in detail. You also can talk about think about, do I need Azure Virtual WAN, for example, if I want to establish a global transit network, if I have certain kind of connections around the globe. It's getting quite complex. And if you want to get architecture decisions or recommendations, there's also, I come to that later on, some reference architectures on Azure where you can have a look, and it's really great explained why are there certain kind of decisions and how it works. Moreover, we also, as I said, we need an Azure, some kind of Azure firewall or Azure NVA. There is an opportunity. Azure firewall is a PaaS service, so we don't have to think about if we have 20, 200 or 2000 requests per second. It scales by default. We don't have to care of that. Microsoft will take care that it scales and functions the right way. But you can also have third-party Azure NVAs, so network virtual appliances like Checkpoint, Barracuda, FortiGate, things like that. They are all available in the marketplace, but you have virtual machines or virtual machine scale sets, and you have to take care about the updates, that it scales, that it's the right size. So quite often customers says, hey, normally we're used to Checkpoint, for example, but more or less to get really the advantage out of an PaaS service for Azure Firewall, we want to use the Azure Firewall instead of an routing concepts. We have to think about the traffic flows. Logging and monitoring is also a big topic. For example, you want to know if your VPN connection or your VPN gateway goes down. You have to collect a certain kind of logs and metrics, performance indicators. How much traffic is going through the VPN connection? Is there a peak time, for example, during the day where a lot of traffic? Is there probably an issue you want to troubleshoot? And that's also why you need some kind of monitoring solution in place. You could use Azure Monitor, but my recommendation is normally the customers have already an on-premise monitoring tool you could use, and you can start from there before you implement Azure Monitor. Quite often customers want to send the data or the performance data or logs and metrics from the on-premise side back from the Azure side back to the on-premise system. That works. You can use an event hub for that, or Log Analytics Workspace, webhooks, whatever, storage accounts. So think about your logging or your monitoring and logging. What will be your strategy? What are thresholds regarding, for example, virtual machines? So, for example, CPU or RAM or disk issues or whatever, IOPS, and you need some kind of alerting pipeline for the monitoring itself. That topics are really necessary to define normally before as well. If you look from a high level perspective, what is not on this chart is the backup strategy, for example. Probably there are certain kind of machines, services, or storage accounts you have to back up. The aspect of business continuity, disaster recovery is not on this board. I mean, what happens if the server or the VPN connection here goes down? Should we switch automatically from West Europe to North Europe? Do we have a requirement regarding disaster recovery? Yeah. What happens if the data center in Amsterdam or West Europe is flooded? Can we switch over instantly to North Europe? Things we also have to consider. Moreover, we have to think about key secrets and certificate management. Quite often customers, especially in the banking and insurance area, having certain kind of special requirements regarding managing keys, because they normally have a hardware security module in place. So they need to be to have the key on premise, and then you can export it to Azure. There are possible scenarios. You can also use third-party management stuff like HashiCorp Vault, for example, to handle your keys and your secrets and certificates. And you have to think about network security. So, for example, public IPs on virtual machines are not allowed. Normally, it makes more sense to put the public IP on the Azure firewall and not the traffic through the firewall. That brings also the advantage that certain kind of attacks to the public firewall can be blocked. And also, there's a threat intelligence feature on the Azure firewall that's always such a machine learning algorithm behind it that always detects certain kind of port scans and stuff as well. So that's also part of security. That's also why I said, think about your routing concept. Yeah, I mean, if the traffic comes in here, go through the firewall and then to the machine, makes probably more sense than put the public IP on the machine and having no control over attacks. Also, think about server provisioning. So how are we going to provide or provision servers in the cloud? Thus, disks must be encrypted, must be certain kind of agents on the machines, like malware agent, disk encryption agent, change tracking agents. Do we have some kind of images with pre-installed software and settings? This is not done within 5 minutes. Normally you have the same stuff like on premise as well, but the image handling and image provisioning is super important, and there are a lot of opportunities regarding Azure, how you're gonna create virtual machines also with infrastructure as code. So as an orientation, all what I talked about is I've listed that for you in this kind of slides, like a checklist. Yeah, I don't want to go through it one more. I just talked about it, and all the listings are there. If you have any questions, also afterwards, let me know. As I already mentioned, you have this kind of Microsoft architecture, reference architecture. So the link is down below. You can check that, and there are really great recommendations. If you, for example, look for hub and spoke, then you get plenty of examples, good examples that you can use. So we can, and there are also explanations and stuff that's really relevant for your enterprise core infrastructure design. So core infrastructure, third part. I mean, we can mark it with a check. I mean, now we talked about the design of the infrastructure, but how are we going to bring it to life on the Azure tenant? I mean, we did some drawings, we did some definitions, we wrote some concepts, but how are we going to implement the whole stuff? First of all, presentation mode. The normal way we know is that we use the graphical user interface of Azure, so the Azure portal, and click our resources and add and create our resource. But I call this approach clickly cloud or clicky bunty because people are clicking and clicking and clicking. Currently, I have a customer. They are very used to click in the cloud and changing resources. And now, but these times are over, and now infrastructure definition looks a little bit like that. Yeah, I know it's not easy if you worked for decades in the infrastructure on premise, and now you have to, instead of click your infrastructure, you have to code it. But that's the normal way, and I've never seen a customer being successful using the Azure portal to create a resource, but to create it with infrastructure as code. It doesn't matter if you use Terraform, Pulumi, Azure Bicep, ARM templates, whatever, but it should be a standardized way. I like to use Terraform. So normally on the Azure portal, you have read permissions maximum. The rest will be done by code, by a service principal, but not by the administrator. So you have a clear, I would say, CI/CD pipeline where you deploy your infrastructure. And you can also bring this kind of CI/CD pipeline and the management of the code and stuff to a cloud operating model, which also helps to manage your infrastructure in a standardized way. Yeah, we talked about it I think in the second session of the Landing Zone series. So also what modularization and templates does, what that means, and why we should do that. What is infrastructure as code? As I mentioned, yeah, we're using code to manage our infrastructure instead of the user interface. We define how resources, application, and the environments in Azure are configured and how they should look like. And we describe more the resources and the whole architecture landscapes instead of single Azure resources. So we can use a declarative syntax like Terraform. We will have a look at the Terraform example after the slide, and how we're going to do a rollout with Terraform. The good thing is also with the infrastructure as code, it's human readable, and we define some variables and values, and then for each environment. So we use the same code, creating, for example, hub and spoke or landing zone in West Europe, and we use the same code creating a hub and spoke landing zone in North Europe or in East US. So the logical stuff is always the same. It's only parameters that changes. So let's have a look at a quick demo. Now we defined our stuff and how it looks like. Yeah, but how we can bring that to life. For example, imagine we are a company called PrettyX, and the PrettyX company wants to do a rollout of their environment. What I did is I work with modularization. So what we do right now, it's big enough. I don't know. Right.
For me, it's okay.
Complain if you can read it. Yeah. For example, we want to create a virtual network for the hub. We want to create a private DNS as well. We want to create a bastion host, and we also want to create private DNS resolver. And also we need some forwarding rules on for the network. So if we want to do a rollout, we can do it now for example, I have this EUW, that's West Europe, so we can create all our resources now in West Europe. As you see, as I said, it's good human readable. You can read your variables like a book, yeah, from top to bottom. That's how your VNet will. That's the naming of the VNet, the name of the resource group, what kind of IP address you have. You can go down which kind of subnets you have. You can go down from top to bottom and read really the specification. And the good thing is the code is always a leading edge. So even if someone's changing manually in the portal with the graphical user interface, when we run the code again, it will be changed back. So we have all the definitions for, as I said, for West Europe, and also we have all the definitions now for North Europe. So we have both files. You see some differences, of course. For example, the IP addresses, overlapping IP addresses are prohibited. That's the reason why we have we have also different IP address ranges, different settings, but the code in the background is still the same. So the modules are the same. And now let's execute and bring the stuff to Azure. Terraform init, I already did. We can also get with the Terraform apply right away. So I tell Terraform, hey, use the West Europe file and execute that. So what is Terraform doing now? It's connecting to my Azure tenant. My Azure tenant is right here with already some resources in it. But as we said, we have some not that many virtual networks, and now we want to create one. So Terraform is still running, and now it's comparing what's in the state file and what's on the Azure tenant, and it will show me the differences and what will be created. So as you see, we would create 85 resources with one step. If you do this with the clicky approach, probably you would need, I don't know, half a day. And now I would say, yeah, what I see here, it looks quite good. So I can see in advance, that would be my virtual network. So this would be the address space of my virtual network. So the plus always shows an add. Yeah, it would add some resources. It would add some NSG associations, also some subnets with the name private endpoint subnet and so on. So everything's defined by code. So I say yes and say it looks all great to me, and let's give it a try. So now Terraform starts to create the virtual network and all the resources in it. So like, for example, with the subnets, NSGs, route tables, the rules on the route tables, and so on. It's a lot of stuff. And normally you could go and grab a coffee, coming back, and your infrastructure is there. The good thing, you see the results, which about the creation, so how far the process is. You can also use, like what I like, is using HashiCorp Terraform Cloud, yeah, to create your resources, because there you can manage your variables. Only keep this in mind, depending on your requirements and cloud strategy. So HashiCorp Cloud, also with the enterprise, but that's not for free. With the enterprise SKU you can use, it's quite nice. Sometimes it makes sense to use that, especially if you want to also provide some modules and private registries and so on. So now our resources, or our Terraform is running, and I do a refresh here. And here also already our VNet is already there. Let's have a look if the configurations are already there. Yeah, the subnets are also there, and also the NSGs are allocated, the route tables are there, so everything's generated automatically. Yeah. So the good thing is, it's always consistent, and you provide your environment with way higher quality. And also, like, I mean, you can also provide your VPN connection with infrastructure as code, your Azure firewall. You can configure, for example, also Microsoft Defender for cloud, whatever. My big recommendation is follow this infrastructure as code principle, and to really be successful along your cloud journey. This runs probably for about, I think, 10 to 15 minutes, depending on normally the Azure Bastion host is the bottleneck, which takes quite long. But as we created it, we also can destroy it. So the good thing is also, if you're using code, you can deploy for example, your development environment in the morning when you start working, and you can destroy it in the evening, so you don't have to pay during the night. All right, so cloud automation, we can also mark it with a check. I know it's quite challenging. You can also use Pulumi. You can also use Ansible, whatever, depending on your requirements. But cloud automation is super important. Don't do clicky. What is also important, work with the module library. I mean, create a module library. For example, we at Experience, we also created a module library. We're going to create module libraries for our customers. What is a module? Yeah, a module is more or less a container of certain kind of resources, on multiple resources that are grouped together. Yeah, so we create more or less a lightweight abstraction. We do not describe the physical objects. We describe more this kind of physical objects. So how our, for example, hub should look like, how a spoke should look like. And we have one module or plenty of modules that are reusable. So we describe our architecture, and we package this kind of modules, and we can also reuse them. Yeah. And we create it in separate repositories. So, and each module must be independently testable and also usable. So how does a module look like? We're going to close that. We're going to have a look in our module library. You see here on the left side plenty of modules already, like a key vault module or a virtual network module. And it's always looking the same. So the structure of the module is always the same. So you have some variable files, you have a main file which define what kind of resources will be created or can be created with the module. You have some kind of opportunities. I think I have about the second series from Infrastructure as Code. The slides are on my GitHub account. You can have a look at that as well. I cannot go that much into detail, but provide reusable parts of code, and these reusable part of codes are called modules. You can also provide the modules in a certain kind of registry. You can use Terraform, you can use GitLab for Terraform registry, no matter what. So the challenge of the automation with what I mentioned in the beginning is, to emphasize this a little bit, we have this click cloud approach, and we want to go further with infrastructure as code. So this is sometimes really a fight in some IT organizations, because infrastructure guys are not really used to define their infrastructure with code. We have to understand the providers, for example, the Azure provider or AWS provider in Azure, Pulumi, Terraform or Pulumi, doesn't matter. We have to bring this kind of providers together into modules, and these modules we have to bring to life and bring all the stuff with the templates to IT operations. So this is more or less kind of a long way. And I know it's not easy to go, and there are certain kind of obstacles and issues, but recommendation is keep going. Cloud automation is the right approach. Don't start again with clicky bunti or clicking in the Azure portal, because then you have an inconsistent infrastructure, and then you have a mixture of code and Azure portal which doesn't make sense normally. So what are the most important steps as a summary? Most important steps, as I said, the columns to the left and to the right. We need a strategy, and this strategy must be working towards our business goals. We have this continuous optimization phase. As we said, if you shift your workload or you implement your enterprise infrastructure in Azure, it's not a one and done or set it and forget it task. You have to also need some kind of optimization phase. because if workloads changes, if you can save costs, you can optimize your processes. Don't stop. It's an ongoing process. So customers have the number one issue if it comes to cloud project is preparation. Be aware that you have a plan in place, that you know where to go, also to avoid unexpected costs or any organizational delays. If you don't know where you want to go, don't be surprised if you be somewhere else you don't want to be. The second part is that you have the right cloud model. Like depending on the requirements, what kind of workload you want to bring to the cloud. Are you using more cloud native, or do you have any legacy applications? Then you probably more tied to virtual machines, and you're forced to use virtual machines, and also check the responsibility. Who's responsible for what? Also have the right partner in place, also for multi-cloud approaches. Probably you have partners instead of one single partner, covering, or have certain kind of technology strength. You want to be focused. Don't put all your eggs into one basket. It's normally doesn't make sense. Also work with plenty of partners if it's necessary. The connection, even probably there to have a proper hybrid connection from your on-premise center to the cloud is really an issue, or was an issue for many customers. Even performance, performance can be a game changer if your connection or hybrid connection doesn't fit to your requirements, or especially with latency and also security, then it's not really fun, to be honest. That's the reason why we have the right plan in place, and be aware what kind of connection you need. And you need also a flow of information along your departments or within your organization. I mean, for example, if you're programming a module library, talk about it. Probably there are other departments who doing the same stuff, providing the same kind of modules. Why not get together and working on one central library that can be used by many departments? Yeah, it really saves times, nerves, and also is way more effective. Conclusion, that's my last slide. As I already said, you know goals, your destinations, have a cloud strategy in place, so you know where I want to go. We talked about don't do things later, like governance. Yeah, we do it later. Strategy. Yeah, we know, but we're gonna do it later. Don't do it. I mean, be aware of that. You need a strategy right from the beginning, and you need an Azure governance concept in place also on your tenant before you shift any workloads to the cloud. Define rules and guardrails. Not only that you have a governance concept in place, but also you have a team, and a team which forces the governance on your tenant is also essential. Also, if you want to bring workloads to the cloud, probably the governance team should also have a look on certain kind of compliance or governance or security issues or pitfalls. So it makes sense to have an interdisciplinary project team that someone from governance is part of your team. Get orientation and rethink. Is that Microsoft CAF is a good indicator, the cloud adoption framework where you can have a look at. Also for the core infrastructure, also think about a little bit outside the box. Also think about how you're going to do backup, how you're going to do disaster recovery. So things that are also on this slide I already showed you. So you're going to get the slide as a checklist. I will upload it to my GitHub account, and you can always have a look at it. We talked about infrastructure as code and cloud automation. Cloud automation. Also provide a central library. It totally makes sense. Don't do any hard-coded Terraform code or resource it. It's normally it's not really flexible, and normally it's if you program it twice, it's double the amount of time. And I saw really weird structures of Terraform modules which are later on not handleable and not really independently testable or usable. then if a module is not reusable, it doesn't make sense. Don't do click cloud. So be focused on infrastructure as code and stay on track. I mean, if you plan a cloud journey, don't change your destinations all the time. Probably there is a reason why you changed, why you choose a certain kind of destination, and follow it according to your, I would say, business justifications, business outcomes you need to have to achieve. So stay on track and follow your cloud journey. Sometimes it's a long way, I know, and sometimes it's not only Azure, but also other hyperscaler. But if it's defined before, you can also bring it to a milestone plan, project plan, and you know what, with the given resources, what can you achieve in a certain amount of time. Right. Last but not least, that's me. I'm working at Spirit as a cloud solution architect. So I know Thomas already for a longer time. Also we work together in Stuttgart at a company. There's also my LinkedIn post. So I'm working more than 15 years in consulting company. I'm only focused on Azure, so I'm doing nothing else than Azure governance, core infrastructure, and application modernization. So if you have an AWS issue, don't ask. I'm really not an expert on this, and I'm a enthusiast about Terraform. I like Terraform the most. That also what we achieved the best results at customers regarding cloud automation. So Terraform is really a powerful tool to spin up your Azure resources and whole environments. It's really fun to me, and I'm glad that I did this choice also already. I think in 2018 I started Terraform programming, which was not that great, but now it's an awesome tool. Yeah. So that's it. So questions. Thomas mentioned that there are already questions in the chat. So I want to know what kind of questions.
Thank you very much, Stefan. So that was really impressive what you demonstrated here. So we have a lot of questions. So maybe we can put or change the order some questions, because I was asked maybe to shift a little bit in questions. So Flo had a lot of questions put into the chat, but maybe we can just go with the comment here. I will be really looking to these reference architecture pointers. Maybe David, you can just share a little bit what you meant by that. Do you need that copy paste or?
No, it's not that. Stefan mentioned that he had architecture pointers that he was going to cover later on, basically, but because there are multiple options of architecture, and I was wondering if you had some blueprints or some kind of documentation with regard to that to help the decision making between options, as opposed to just starting with a blank piece of paper.
Okay, I'm going to show you. If you can post a link in the chat, so that's what it's probably the questions about. So if you have any kind of questions regarding for example, you want to establish a solution for Azure Virtual Desktop, and there you can also see some recommended architectures, and also with certain kind of explanations here, and how you're going to implement that. So it's super helpful if you have really no clue in the beginning, or there's certain kind of questions. Check this reference architectures, and also for example, also the Microsoft well-architected framework about the detailed infrastructure. You can also get the Visio file and stuff and adjust it to your environment. And it's also explained the certain kind of which service is doing what, why do you need it? Yeah. And it's a good introduction point if you're getting if you have architecture decisions, and you can derive from this kind of explanations probably something for your organization or your architecture chart, which also helps you. And there's so many explanations here. That's normally one of the first pages or of the sites where, if I going into a new topic, where I have a look at. So it's very helpful.
Perfect, Stefan. Exactly what I was looking for. That's great. Thanks.
Yeah, you also
it's really
put
full of
a
stuff here. This architecture reference architecture. So it's really great. Yeah.
David, you also put a comment here. You would get the image builds firmed up and validated with a governance team, and only have these pushed to the prod, including vulnerability tests. Fair.
So, yeah, so what I was trying to say is the same thing that Stefan was mentioning with regard to having the GUI in read-only, right? Same fashion to limit chaos, basically. I would imagine that you would not let your developers just like any kind of build, but have the build in your repository, all validated, scanned, especially if you have a bit of intelligent code and not just OS. You're going to have vulnerabilities, so you need to have the governance building that and only have people looking at this and changing that repository if you need to change it, if there is some additional features needed, basically. Otherwise, I don't see how you manage it.
So you want to know how you manage the central library or the repositories with the modules, right? Correct.
Right.
Yeah, okay. So normally you have to change a little bit your organization regarding, you have, for example, I think we did that in the second series or second part of the series. For example, normally you have a platform team in place, and the platform team is the level which is creating the modules and also managing the modules along its life cycle. Because each Friday, for example, a new Terraform provider will come out, and you have to be up to date with your modules and that they are still running. Yeah, and the platform team has a job to make some also do the automation of the modules, that they are automatically updated and tested, and that there are test cases in place. Also, because a module has an example, and this example must be executable, and that the platform team will take care of this kind of repository, of the repositories and the examples and the code. The product team, for example, governance team is a product team. The product team will consume the modules to, for example, bring policies in place, to bring role-based access control in place. If we have a look here at the code, you can see I have for the governance features like cost management, I have or consumption budget, I have a module. Also for role-based access control, so for roles, role definitions, for assignments, I have a module. For management groups, I have a module. So the governance team can consume these modules to create all the policies, RBUCs, consumption budgets you really need, or they really need. But the consumption budget, the governance team is a product team, not really a platform team. So you separate platform team, which is taking care of the modules, and the product team, which is taking care of, for example, governance or the core landing zone or a web application or whatever. And then on top you have also the solution team. Yeah, but that's probably too much for that, but for this talk. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's clear. You abstract from the governance team the plumbing, basically, of the environment. It makes sense.
Yeah. So the governance team is consuming the modules.
So, Flo, would you mind if I let Andy proceed with his question before starting into your batch of questions? So I think the name convention is just short to be answered, maybe. So then I would ask this here. I'm curious about naming scheme. What is your thought about naming scheme? Are you using some kind of shortened name types? So the question was from Andy.
Yes. I think we did it in the second. Go to the Azure naming convention. So if we have a look, there's the cloud adoption framework, and in the cloud adoption framework, Microsoft is doing quite good recommendations regarding naming. I mean, more often or quite often, you have already naming conventions in place which are coming from the on-premise side. So normally your company is having probably some naming conventions already. This naming conventions is the same like with the hierarchy. It's not written in stone. It's only a recommendation. Yeah, so it can be tailored, and you can do changes to this kind of naming convention which Microsoft defines in the Cloud Adoption Framework. There are certain kind of abbreviations for certain kind of services. I would normally use them as a prefix. Yeah. And after the prefix, for example, then you use it for kind of, certain kind, what kind of workload it is. Then the environment, dev, test, prod, and also the location. The thing is, you want to use the naming convention for, you want to see what is this resource good for, yeah, and you need certain kind of information from the resource. So if you need, for example, besides SharePoint, you need some kind of, what kind of application it is in SharePoint, for example, web application or intranet, yeah, then you can also write pip SharePoint minus intranet minus prod minus West US minus and then the instance number. Yeah. So what I like to do is I can open that real quick. I always provide some naming templates, documents. So I think it's part of governance. There's my naming convention. Here it is. I always like to do, I think we had it in the second series. I like to use what kind of resource type we're going to use. Then I define the pattern, and then I give an example. So that's normally what I do. That's, now that's Word. It's really a pain with Word, but or you can also use Excel. But normally I'm going to think about how I'm going to structure names for customers with also their requirements. So see, okay, I see, for example, the NSG. This NSG that sits on a NIC, not on a subnet. Okay, I can see it because I want to see where's this network security group allocated to, for example. Okay. It really depends. But that's a good indicator, good start. So I would say recommend use the naming convention of the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework and start from there.
Really cool. Thanks. I already shared the link to that. Then starting as promised with a question from Flo. Starting with 1. In sum, it is until 7, I see. So be prepared, Stefan. So first question, could you provide examples for customers running in the opposite direction of what they actually wanted? That was mentioned when you talked about the cloud strategy. Examples would make that more clear. First one.
Yeah. Unfortunately, what I had to do quite often is also, beside Azure Cloud Strategy, Azure Governance, or Core Infrastructure, I had to do Azure Reviews. Azure Reviews are quite often the case if customers start implementing all their workloads under one subscription, and then later on they cannot separate their role-based access controls, they cannot pay the invoice, they cannot separate the resources. So also from a financial perspective, it was really a pain. Governance was not in place. The 20 to 30 global admins on the tenant, no MFA activated. So it really makes sense to think about certain kind of topics like we mentioned here in the presentation before we bring any workloads to the cloud. Yeah, and it's not always tied to a certain kind of branch, or it's manufacturing, insurance, and so on. All they need help, and it's always good that we have some kind of Azure reviews. So that's the optimum, that's where you are, and that's the gap, and we have to bridge that gap, and you need some action plans to bring the organization to, I would say, best practice approach, what also Microsoft recommends. I always say stay as close to the standard and to the best practices of Microsoft as possible, because later on it can avoid certain kind of trouble.
Okay. Second question then. Yes. VNet peering costs, money per transferred gigabyte and out. In your experience, is that expensive or just a tiny cost position compared to other costs?
Depending on the workload. Normally, it's VNet to VNet is so non-global global VNet peering. I think the global VNet peering is 5 cents per gigabyte, and within the same data center, I think it's 2 cents per gigabyte, if I'm correct. But I need to have a look at the cost calculator. So that's also something before you're going to start. If you know how many data you send over your peering, use the cost calculator and calculate your costs. But normally, from my perspective, it's not really the most expensive block, to be honest.
Flo, in case no questions are really answered to your needs, and just step in and just hold on. I need a couple of seconds more. I would go to the third question. So when you do staging, like a dev test prod, for testing purposes, would you stage the tenant too, so that you have 2 or 3 tenants, prod, non-prod, or dev test prod? Something like
Good
this.
question. Yeah.
I know.
So what Microsoft recommends is don't do the staging on a management group level. Yeah. For example, that you have the whole environment in dev and test separated. Yeah. Normally, you're gonna do it on a subscription level or on a management group level, depending on your requirements. I had customers that said, "Hey, the guys who need access to the test also need to, or to dev or to test, need also access to the prod." So they placed all under one subscription or under the same management group. It depends. Regarding the landing zone, I always check with the customer if they have on-premise already separated environments. That also means they have separate environments regarding the network. So if they have a test network and a prod network, that also means they have test domain controllers and prod domain controllers. And normally customers doesn't have that. They do not have such a clear separation of tests and test and prod. Normally, the landing zone is a shared environment also, or shared place also for dev and test. So all the workloads go through the Azure firewall or through the hub, also for cost reason. Because if you need a virtual hub like this one we have here, all the stuff which is in the virtual hub multiplied twice. That means also double the costs. So also double the VPN connection. Yeah, that it really depends on the requirements, but most of the customers say we don't have a separation on premise, and at the moment we don't want to have that in the cloud either. So more or less they start with a central hub, and all the services are running through this through the hub. And then you can also separate your workloads, like for example, you have a web application, dev, test, and then probably prod here. Yeah. So you can separate it in different spokes. That's totally doable. Fair enough. That's totally fine. It depends on the workload, but normally you should separate it on resource groups or subscription.
Yeah. Just spin on your mic and then jump in, Phil. So.
Okay, if there is a requirement to have the hub or the whole infrastructure staged as well, would you then recommend staging the tenant? The reason for that is we would split on a subscription level. So each application has 3 subscriptions. However, if we change something on a tenant level, then that change has to be staged too. So there's the question, is it necessary to stage the tenant, or would you rather recommend one tenant but multiple management groups, and then within those management groups many subscriptions?
Stage the tenant means on Azure AD level as well?
Yeah, that I don't want to answer. I want to hear your recommendation.
Okay. Be careful if you separate. I mean, for example, we're having Microsoft recommends for an organization a single tenant strategy normally. Yeah, it really depends on the requirements, but because you can run into problems with Azure AD Connect as well, because I don't know which kind of scenarios are separated, but sometimes you have issues if you have one Active Directory, single forest, single domain on premise, and you want to use, for example, one or more tenant on the Azure side, because you have to write back the MSDS consistency GUID, and it could cause trouble depending on the scenario. So
Okay.
honestly, I mean, there are some. That real quick. Here we are. That's are the supported scenarios, yeah. And here you have, for example, if you work with one AD on premise and you have 3 tenants, yeah, be aware that here with multiple AD tenants, that's probably your scenario. You have to read through the whole stuff, but it could bring you some challenges. Yeah, I'm gonna post that into the chat.
I see. If the scenario is that we have multiple forests which are set up either having only prod or having 3 different stages like dev and prod or dev test prod.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess I have to read the whole article in order to.
Then you can separate it depending on I don't know your structure or company structure by heart, but if you have separated, for example, AD structure on premise dev test prod, you can also separate it. Then separated means single forest, single domain for dev, single forest, single domain for test, and for prod as well. Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Then it makes sense. Then you have really sounds like a validated environment or so.
I was asking that question because I was talking to one of the engineers of the EZB, Europäische Zentralbank, and he told us or me that in their experience it was really helpful to stage the tenants too, because rarely but sometimes you have to make changes on the tenant level, which then influence the whole chain to the lowest level, and rarely but sometimes that crashes or some applications are getting interrupted by that, and therefore in order to play with that and really test that, their experience was it was a good idea to stage the tenants too. But I'm not sure if those changes are common or really rarely, and it mostly you do changes on your management level, for example, or on your subscription level or something.
Yeah, no, I mean, even if you have different tenants, you also have then applications spread over 3. I mean, dev, test, prod over 3 tenants, right? That would also be the effect.
Yeah, we are used to having splitted environments. However, there are always those infrastructure-like services which are really always hard. Example, DNS. How do you make sure that everyone is talking DNS, but within its range and not furthermore? And, so on. And how do you stage DNS then? Yeah, central services are always hard. Yeah.
It's not always DNS. It's also is dev from test and from prod totally isolated from network perspective, or do you need some peerings as well between dev and test?
Both. So we're quite huge. Therefore, sometimes it's or mostly it's isolated, but sometimes there are cross connections between those.
I mean, we could talk more in detail about the requirements, but from a guts perspective, I try to avoid it because Microsoft says single domain, and I've seen customer with 3, 4, 10 different tenants. I mean, if you have a merchant acquisition scenario, I would say, okay, probably then later on you cut off the subsidiary and goodbye. Yeah, but if you're one company and you separate it by stages, the tenant, I wouldn't. I mean, write a documentation about your advantages and disadvantages. You can, as the link here, you can run into trouble quite easily. Yeah, maybe you have an unsupported scenario. Yeah.
I see. Maybe we can tackle the question from another perspective. For example, is there a list of possible changes I can do to a tenant. So for example, if there are, I don't know, not that many change or possibilities or parameters to set up, then I can figure out, okay, just, I don't know, 100 different parameters. So, and then I take a look at them closely and figure out, okay, depending on those.
It really depends on the use case you wanna cover. I don't know a list or so where you can go through.
Okay.
Not at all. I mean, but I'm not a big fan of multi-tenant scenarios, to be honest.
I see. Okay. The next question we could skip because you already answered that in your talk later on.
Okay, all good. Next one. Number 7 then, all right?
No. It's we skipped number 4. So number 5. Will you stage dev test prod your hub too? If so, or is it also skippable? If so, if it dev resource needs to be.
Yeah, we already kind of covered that. So for example, if I have to stage the hub, and then the resource in dev environment needs to connect to a resource in the test environment, would you then recommend to let the traffic flow pass both hubs, or would you set up the traffic route another way?
Okay. Imagine this is what is your prod hub.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then probably you would have your test hub here as well. Yeah.
Yes.
It's not there yet, but it could be. If you need to exchange data between test and prod, you can also use this kind of peering between the two hubs. But from an auditing perspective, make sure that your firewall is blocking or only allows certain kind of traffic. Yeah, to make sure that control your traffic. So what kind of test is allowed to access some stuff in prod or what? Or for example, yeah, I would keep it really strict, to be honest, because otherwise you could also end up in some kind of mess of traffic routing scenarios. Yeah, because I mean, there's a reason why probably test and dev and pod is isolated from each other. Yeah, but normally if you have here something like here, you have this kind of, I have it here in dotted lines, but this ones are peerings, and you can peer the two networks if needed.
And then traffic would, from a dev, for example, would go to the dev hub, then to the test hub, and then to the test resource. So passing both hubs. Is that?
Yes, that would be then the case. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, otherwise you have to go. If here's the hub, then you go from the hub over the virtual net over the VPN to on-premise, and from on-premise over the VPN connection, then to through the firewall, probably to, for example, your virtual machine. That would also be possible. Then you have it totally isolated, but then you have probably latency issues.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, would you like to continue your questions?
Sure, why not? So the next is regarding if you have to follow a multi-cloud approach, where would you place your CI/CD pipeline or your Git runners, or I don't know, your Terraform runners or something? Would you store it within Azure or AWS or Google Cloud, or would you store it on premise, or would you use a software as a service like a GitHub or something?
It really depends on what you're using. I mean, what I like to use to handle my stuff with the state files and for Terraform, I like to use Terraform Cloud. Yeah, because I can see any details here. Yeah, I can see the history of the state file, for example, who triggered what and so on. And you can also there's also an API you can use from a pipeline perspective. For example, you can do a CI/CD pipeline and using Azure DevOps to if there are changes, stuff is automatically triggered in the Terraform Cloud. Yeah. For example, you can do an auto apply, or you can also establish that you need an approval before someone doing a rollout of the stuff. Yeah, that's totally doable. Yeah. But you can also reprogram this kind of process in your with your GitLab runners. We have customers running the GitLab runners running on Azure. It's totally doable. But also you can use Azure DevOps. You can use GitHub. Depending on what kind of DevOps environment you have in place in your company.
Okay. So your personal approach would be software as a service. I'm asking because multi-cloud is probably due to outage redundancy. So, for example, if a hyperscaler would be, or a region where you deployed your stuff is completely out of service, and you have the possibility to make your most mission critical items available in another hyperscaler environment as well, then it would be
I mean,
stupid.
yeah,
if your CI/CD pipeline would be in that same outage affected cloud region.
Got it. Okay. For example, you have here the region West Europe. I mean, if you, as I said, if we talk about then disaster recovery and you have a totally outage of in West Europe, you need a North Europe region. So North Europe region would be here as well, and attached to your data center with a proper VPN connection. And normally you have your GitLab runners or any others here in the spoke, just in case if the West Europe data center goes down, the North Europe data center can take over.
Okay.
So that works. I mean, that's what we are currently also implementing at another customer. So the GitLab runners are running on machines in Azure. And it's also across reach. So we have in the Europe data center, we're in West Europe and North Europe. For example, in APAC region, I think it was Southeast Asia and Japan. I'm not sure. But you always need some kind of redundancy, just in case that one data center in the region goes down, you have another one.
Okay.
And it's also working with your runners.
Okay. Great. Then the 7th question we also already covered due to what you sent me. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, you're welcome.
A lot of questions. It's always good to have afterwards a nice discussion about knowledge, opinions, perspectives. So that's always good. Let's see if we had any further questions. Just comments. I think staging into different tenants makes management and managed service identities more easy. I think that's opinion. Andy, don't know. Or experience.
Yeah, depends on the use case.
In case it can easily increase the cognitive load going down to the road of multi-tenant. As a statement to that. Yeah, and multi-cloud Kubernetes to run your runners.
Yeah, it's also working.
There are a lot of approaches to make this happen. Yeah, multi-cloud is something that is really to be discussed. Often it's not the best idea, but I understand why.
Yeah, but thank you very much for this for the great questions. Yeah, it's as you see, there's not single truth and or what's right, what's wrong. It always depends on the use cases and the requirements and what situation you have in your organization. So quite often I cannot say, hey, this is the right way to go, but it really depends on the requirements. And also you have probably different perspectives from different departments and what's really best. Yeah. And but if you have any questions that's coming into your mind, let me know. If you're struggling and say, this is I don't know, and probably need a recommendation, let me know.